on the Chinese continent about 5,000 years ago, when the old gods still dwelt in this land, it suddenly appeared as if it were seeping out from the earth. It went on a slaughter without rest. It killed people, beasts, demons, and gods alike. Eventually, its eyes were stained black by the blood of its victims. Its name was Wu Hei, the first Wu.
What you just heard was the Chinese recitation of the origin of the Wu clan, or specifically the first Wu. And as you could obviously tell, and I went out of my way to actually show this, there's a lot of supernatural and creepy tones around it. And so one has to ask themselves this question: is this story true? Or if all of it is not true, how much of it is actually true? And that is exactly what I'll be exploring in this video. And of course, a little bit of a spoiler of what's to come, but this story is actually a lot more accurate than you might actually think, especially with the stuff that has been established in the Kengan story already. But before we get into any of that, don't forget to like and sub. I cover Kengan theory and analysis content all the time, so hey, if you like that, please sub, drop a like, all that stuff, and yeah, let's get on with the actual video. One of the most important things that we're probably going to need to understand as soon as possible is what the Wu clan symbolize. This is very important, especially when it comes to understanding the Wu clan itself, but also what part they might play in the greater narrative. And when you gain that understanding, things tend to be a lot more easier to figure out. That's how I personally end up forming my theories. And so what ended up coming to mind was, of course, dogs. And yes, this would be very important, how dogs and the Kure clan sort of mirror each other, and how this is important to their origins. See, what we know about dogs is that, well, they come from an ancient ancestor that was, of course, called Canis lupus. Canis lupus is part of the gray wolves, so it's just another canine. And once we started domesticating dogs, we ended up doing selective breeding so that they could fulfill certain purposes we had for them. And so the huge variety there is in dogs is something that we're responsible for as well. But also, they do serve a purpose, at least most breeds do. From Kanekosos to golden retrievers, they have that servitude sort of role. And we see this a lot in the Kure clan, starting off with the easiest, and that is the selective breeding. We do know that the Kure clan practice this, but the Wu clan probably does as well. I wouldn't be surprised if the Wu Hei Westwood faction clan also did that as well. The other thing that's also important towards their symbolization and why they're comparable to dogs is, of course, their servitude. All of them serve someone. The Kure clan, of course, are assassins for hire. They serve anyone who's willing to pay them. But particular individuals seem to have strong loyalties towards a single individual. So for Kure Uryo, this was, of course, Metsudo. For Edward Wu and Gilbert, it is the connector Shen Wulong. Even Ryan, the most rebellious of, honestly, any Wu clan I've seen, calls Oma his partner. This is specific language we use to say, of course, someone is very close to you. And so this is just a consistent theme among them. And so it seems as though with this symbolization that we might be onto something fairly big, mainly being that the, of course, Canis lupus actually comes from a canine or wolf family. And the Wu clan more than likely has a similar type of foundation, that being that the first Wu is more than likely a human being, which actually does a lot for our theories, because now we can actually start looking for clues of how you turn a human being to what the first Wu ended up being, giving us a lot more direction to the mystery of the origins of course, the Wu clan and the first Wu. There are two characters that we're going to look at that give us a lot more of a clue to whether or not this hypothesis of turning a human being to, let's say, the first Wu is even possible. The first person that we will take a look at is Kano Agito. Now, Kano Agito is a very important character, especially in Kengan Ashura. In Kengan Ashura, he was the Fang of Metsudo, known as one of the strongest, if not the strongest fighter in Kengan history at the time. But what's also important is that he also served Metsudo and was the successor of course, Kure Uryo, who is part of the Kure clan, which is of course one of the split off factions of the Wu clan. This is very important because it shows one of the connections that Agito has to this, but also that Uryo even calls Agito in Kengan Ashura his successor. However, there are a lot of special things that are going on with Agito, because we know he is, of course, from China, and that his upbringing was not normal, because while he was still a child, he was of course taken captive at some point, and Togita Nico used him in a Gu ritual. For those who are not familiar with what a Gu ritual is, although most of you will be, a Gu ritual is essentially one of the rituals that the worm used to practice when it came to locking up a whole bunch of people and making them kill each other so that one person could, of course, come out on top, and that person would be a lot more stronger. However, one of the side effects of this, and we see this with Agito, is the fact that, well, his mental states, especially since he was a child, broke down almost completely, and Agito ended up having two personalities and constantly refers to himself as we. So we do know that one of the side effects of the Gu ritual is having a mental breakdown, essentially. However, going through the Gu ritual also made him extremely powerful, since he was the one who ultimately survived, at least to a certain extent. And so, even though the event itself was traumatizing, it is the source of Agito's strength to a certain extent. The reason why he can switch between formless and martial arts, one of his greatest assets, is because of the Gu ritual. And I want people to keep in mind, because I will come back to this later. The second character that we will look at is connected to Agito and is also very important as well. And that is Lu Tian. Lu Tian was introduced in Kengan Omega in the Kengan vs. Purgatory arc, and was the person that fought Kano Agito. And throughout the story, or throughout their fights, there's a lot of parallels drawn between Agito and Lu Tian, where Lu Tian is basically the version of Kano Agito that didn't get saved by Metsudo. And something that's very important about Lu Tian is, of course, he is also mentally disturbed because he went through the Gu ritual, but he is also very special in the case that he is essentially one of the, or a 1 in a million type of person who, despite not being a part of the Wu clan, is able to use the removal. This is actually fairly big because, again, if we're establishing the types of connections that these characters have, it's more than likely that Lu Tian in specific being able to use removal, a Wu Clan technique, or a technique that is specifically attributed to the Wu Clan, is more than likely not a coincidence. And this all has to do with, of course, him having great talent, but also him surviving the Ghoul ritual. It is more than likely the combination of both these things that allowed Lu Tian to have the body and the resilience to use the removal. However, eventually in his fight against Agito, something very interesting happens. Lu Tian, despite him not being the most mentally stable person, when he uses removal, he goes insane in the fight, or loses mental control, you could say. And when he does this, we've seen this effect before when someone uses the event or removal, but their eyes, or at least the outside of their eyes, turn black instead of the normal whites that they are, which is reminiscent, of course, of the Kure or the Wu Clan. And so when we look at these characters, we see a formula at work here, and it all really traces back to the Ghoul ritual, which is where I'll go back to Agito and Metsudo, since Metsudo was the one who ultimately saved Agito from ultimately falling in character by pulling him out of the Ghoul ritual. Now, this is very important because in a flashback in Kengan Ashura, we get to see how Metsudo did this. And what's very interesting is that when Agito was found, he was placed underground. That's very, very important. He was placed underground, and Metsudo with his entire team had to dig the entire room of the Ghoul ritual out in order to save Agito or to save any survivors that were there. And so, it's more than likely the case that the Ghoul ritual, which might have been invented by the worm itself since it originates from them, seems to be the key formula into creating what was the first Wu or the Wu clan. And Togita Nico seems to be somewhat aware of that fact, unless he bumped into this by coincidence. But with all that being said, what can be said in conclusion of all of this? Well, what I think is important here is that, calling back to the introduction of this video, knowing what we know now, everything makes sense. The first Wu was more than likely a part of a Ghoul ritual that was underground. And the reason he seeps out from the ground is because that is the entire process of the Ghoul ritual. The conditions, however, that you have to meet within the Ghoul ritual are very specific. The first, of course, is that you have to be a specifically talented type of person. The second condition is that you probably have to use removal or some other type of technique and survive using that technique in that Ghoul ritual. Once you have done that, it's more than likely the case that you will emerge as the first Wu. And with that, you might also be as powerful as the first Wu was, because it is implied that Wu Hei was very powerful. However, for now, we've sort of completely mapped out our theory here. So, what are your thoughts? Is it good? Are we off? And what do you want to add to this theory? Don't forget to like and sub, all that fun stuff. And until next time, take it easy.